Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance tonight. We're all delighted you could come to honour our dear friend Ray Evans. I note the presence here of Jill, Ray's wife. It's been too long since we last saw each other. I also note Ray's daughter Jackie and some of his grandchildren are here tonight too. You all to know how much we dearly miss Ray. As Tim has said, my name's Carl Katazi. I'm the president of the HR Nicholls Society, one of the many organisations that Ray was instrumental in establishing. And I'm proud to say this one is still going strong, fighting the cause for deregulated labour markets. If anyone here tonight isn't a supporter, we'd love to have you on board. Please visit our website. I'm also very honoured to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Mr. Andrew Bolt. Andrew is one of the few men in Australia who ordinarily needs no introduction. He is famous, or perhaps infamous, for his Herald Sun column and Sky News nightly show. There's probably little I can tell you about him that you don't already know. So instead, I'm going to address why Andrew is actually such an appropriate speaker to honour the memory of Ray. The reason is that, like Ray, Andrew started life on the political left. Unlike Andrew, Ray was not a household name, but he was a cult legend in conservative political circles, particularly within the Victorian Liberal Party, where he was something of a mentor to many scores of people. And those who knew him well knew that he had a unique background as a union official and Labor Party operative during his early adulthood. It was when exposed to the extreme communist left of Labor in the 1960s that he began his moves to the right. And like most converts, he adopted the cause with a religious-like fervour. Andrew, on the other hand, started out as a cadet journalist at The Age, no the communist connection, and worked on two Bob Hawke campaigns in the 1980s. Ironically, this is the same time as Bob Hawke was describing Ray and us at the HR Nicholls as industrial ayatollahs. It's hardly an auspicious start for Andrew. But once he became a columnist at the Herald Sun, he began the slow move to the right, and he has similarly now adopted the cause with the convert zeal. He was for long well known to Melbourne readers of the Herald Sun, but he exploded onto the national scene with the creation of his blog in the early 2000s, and then particularly his infamous conviction by the federal court for breaching Section 18C. Shame on the coalition for not abolishing it. Andrew may not realise this, but he is one of the few people in Australian public life who can almost always be relied upon to put the Conservative case on any issue. Unlike milquetoast Liberal politicians we currently have, Andrew can't be voted out of his job, so he is not worried about who doesn't like his opinions. Just as Ray was one of the lone wolves in the early 1980s, pushing what seemed to be the hopeless cause of industrial deregulation, Andrew similarly opens the Overton window to allow Conservative positions to be openly discussed and therefore attain eventual credibility. This is why he is so hated by the left. Please put your hands together for Andrew Bolt.
Golly, I feel I better start with apologising for myself. It wasn't actually an ideological sort of commitment that drove me to the arms of Labor. It was a need for a job, basically. I was in Darwin as working as a minder to my then girlfriend who was belly dancing up there. I realised that she was in no danger whatsoever, so I went to a CES office, that's what it was called then, and saw jobs wanted. I didn't check which party wanted me. I just did the Malcolm Turnbull thing and went for who would have me. Ah, dearie me. If only the Liberals had said no to him, eh? But anyway, he's getting his revenge now for that piece of stupidity. So that explains that. It wasn't quite the road to Damascus conversion that you might have thought there. But I've obviously had little prods along the way and moments of inspiration that's developed my thinking and given me some courage to go the direction I've gone in. And I'm here tonight to pay tribute to one of the more important ones, and that's Ray Evans. Died 4 years ago. Lovely to catch up with you again, Jill. I really admired your husband. Great man. A great man. John Roscombe, who couldn't be here tonight, said to me this morning that Ray had more influence on politics and policy in Australia than 95% of MPs in the federal parliament, with an exception over here, obviously. You're the 5%, exactly. No, you're the 4%. There's 1% about to grow into. And I find this really remarkable because of what I want to talk about tonight, that Ray managed that without ever being elected to an office outside that, other than one that he'd helped create himself, without being given yards of column inches in a newspaper twice a week, without being given a TV show, without... The only platforms he ever graced, basically, were ones he helped build himself. That is, to me, astonishing. The power of one. For me, that's Ray. He had a real influence on my career. I've been through a couple of tough times, and at one stage I was thinking, do I pull back? It was getting a bit much, and Ray sent me a letter. I'll just read it to you. I thought it summed up Ray, not least because it started with a quote from, I think it was his favourite book, The Pilgrim's Progress. Thanks to Ray, I put some of my hard-earned onto a beautiful bound volume of The Pilgrim's Progress, myself at an auction. Dear Andrew, it just started with a quote. Who would true valour see, let him come hither. One here will constant be, come wind, come weather. There is no discouragement will make him once relent. His first avowed intent is to be a pilgrim. Whoso beset him round with dismal service, do not themselves confound, his strength the more is. Ray was that pilgrim. He went on to say John Bunyan was a thinker and spent 12 years in jail for refusing to give up preaching without a license. He wrote The Pilgrim's Progress in prison. He was one of the great pioneers of freedom of speech and the freedom to dissent from religious authorities of whatever kind. We are hugely indebted for him. I use him in my eulogy for Bert Kelly. Best wishes, Ray. Ray was telling me, just sending me this to basically shame me into keeping on going, which I did. Seeing I've just said to Sky I'm going to quit, that shows that his influence has waned a little, but there it is. Why is it that Ray... See, in this room are people that have created jobs for many others. That is a great talent. There are people who in politics have created an economy from which we all benefit. That is a great talent. There are people who created companies here. All great, great things to do. People who have taught others at universities. Ray had a different gift. Again, the power of one. He had the gift to inspire. And I remember, this is such an underrated thing. And so many of us can actually do it. A word in season, a letter in the right time. Ray did it, I think, full time. You got to know, when I was at the age, I well understand this power of groupthink. I remember once going into the office of B.A. Santa Maria for the first time. I literally felt a thrill of fear, that excited fear that you're transgressing to go into his office, because I knew he was supposedly the demon. It was rather disappointing to find that he was actually quite a nice bloke. Ray was not quite the fearful person, but to be in his presence, you noted someone that had no fear. No fear. He was a man who would follow where the facts and the evidence led him. And you could say anything about or against him, and he would keep going. It's rather, the left tend to work on the quite human fear of being ostracised and demonised, and for most people that works. If you're out of the crowd, it's one of the things about being human. You get very anxious if you're not in the group. We don't like to be alone. And yet for some of us, to see one person alone against the mob, proclaiming a truth, a John Bunyan in a prison, or Ray Evans facing a mob, not quite literally, but you know what I mean, is actually rather exciting. You'd rather be Horatio than the army against him. And I wondered, what drove Ray? Well, it didn't take long, of course, to find that out. Who in turn inspired Ray? Well, Christianity obviously was very, very important to him. A muscular Christianity, which I so greatly respect. The King James Bible was one of the glories he referred to. The Anglican Book of Common Prayer, again, which I bought because he told me to. I'm not a Christian, but there you go. He was halfway to converting me. He left us too soon. The power of one pilgrim undaunted, I think, is just so, well, that's the start of Christianity, isn't it? Really, too, the example of Christ. And the other thing I think that gave him, through a deep knowledge of the history of the church and the received wisdom that it embodies of human nature, is a distillation of human nature in a sense, and human experience and human wisdom, that nothing was new to him. Nothing was new under the sun. He could spot old frauds in new clothes, one of them being global warming. I'll get onto that. I just want to briefly pay tribute. We all know the bare bones of what he actually did. And I'm not going to repeat something that you would know much better than I, particularly those of you who were with him in some of these activities. I was working for Hugh Morgan, of course, at Western Mining. Brilliant in achieving the sort of workplace freedoms, critical in that. One of the founding members of the HR Nicholls Society with John Stone, Peter Costello, Brian Purvey. Samuel Griffiths Society helped to create that, the Galatians Group. But I want to talk about the two where he probably had less success. One of them almost no success, tragically. The Bennalong Society and the Lavoisier Group. With those, I think, there's one other thing I think that Christianity gives you, and that's the long view, if you're really devout. The long view. There's more to us than our mortal span. You've got to live long enough to see truth win in the end. You didn't live long enough for these two causes. The Bennalong Group is probably where he had his least success, which is a great, great, great tragedy, as we've seen this year again, where he urged us, he with Peter Howson, another very fine Australian, later Gary Johns, urging us to pay attention to what we don't pay attention to, where the media turns away from, where the politicians don't want to get involved. Domestic violence, the dysfunction in Aboriginal communities. This year, again, we see a 2-year-old raped in Tennant Creek. You see children, this is actually happening so often. I saw a journalist go up to Tennant Creek and talk to someone there, and they said, well, what really surprised us about this rape of the 2-year-old is not that it happened, but that it created such a fuss, because this happens so often. And you know it does. And yet it's too hard. You've got a whole industry of activists that would rather change the constitution or get new laws against speech or whatever. Or they actually, the one protest I saw of Aboriginal groups at the rape of that 2-year-old was outside Channel 7, complaining that someone said that maybe we should take more kids away. That was the one protest I saw. What a disgrace. This is what Ray was railing against, as well as the apology to the stolen generation. One of the great, great frauds, one of the most damaging frauds in Australian history. I note Keith Windshuttle, who's done some great work on this area in exposing this. To this day, whenever a case for compensation has been brought to the courts for someone claimed to have been stolen, every single case has failed. Every single one. The one exception actually is the exception that proves the rule. That's in South Australia, where Bruce Trevorrow won his claim for compensation because it had indeed been stolen. Why does that prove the rule? Because it had been stolen in breach of the law that said children couldn't be stolen. There was no policy to steal children. He was stolen by one social worker activist working in secret, alone, and for what reason? Not as Robert Mann would have, to breed the Aboriginal out of them and destroy the Aboriginal culture. It was because he'd been lying in bed, in hospital, for weeks, and his parents hadn't brought him there and hadn't visited him there, and she had heard that they didn't want him and would mistreat him. And so she stole him. That's the stolen generation. That's the one case we've had. The one. Ray knew this. He hadn't seen the cases, of course, that had come from before the court since, but he had the courage to proclaim this truth because he knew our history. Peter Costello's aunt knows this history. She was in one of the homes that is supposedly one of the, I think it was the one in Alice Springs. It's just so sad. As a consequence of that, Aboriginal children have died. I can tell you the names of more Aboriginal children who have died because they were left in homes where they should have been saved and would have been saved if they'd been white. I can name more of them than I can name Aboriginal children truly stolen just because they were Aboriginal. Ray had more success with the Lavoisier Group. Well, he had some success with the first bit because he gave me courage to pursue this too. Makes a difference. He introduced me to people like Peter Howson. And you know how it is. You think, gosh, I'm going out on a limb. I'm risking so much. But if someone whose wisdom you really respect and whose heart you trust says you're on the right track, that is inspiring. The Lavoisier Group, I think he had more success there. I said earlier on that he could recognise old frauds in new clothes. I think he would have loved seeing the drum in a horrified way. You know how we love having our worst prejudices confirmed. The drum on the ABC the other night. There was a woman priest from the Uniting Church. For those of you that don't know, that's the church that doesn't believe in God. She was there in a full clerical garb with a crucifix. Dr. Avril Hannah-Jones. And she spoke on climate change. And she said on climate change, we, don't you love the collective we, as the population, would really like the government to do something about this before we all drown or melt. That, of course, normally you've heard this kind of message before. There's someone on a sandwich board in the corner of a street saying, repent for the end of the world is nigh. Normally you give them a wide berth, you don't make eye contact. But this repent for the end of the world is nigh gets a gig on the ABC and is not questioned by anyone. I find that really quite astonishing. This is, in fact, a new religion that borrows the Christian paradigm. I saw it when I challenged Al Gore. It was, again, a holy roller, kind of, Southern Baptist, stomp, stomp, stomp. this is the idea that we face a hellfire. I mean, no science will tell you that we're going to all drown or melt. That's ridiculous. You know, the seas will probably go up this much in the next 50 years if the current rate continues, not all caused by man. If you're going to get drowned by seas going up that fast, you really got to just take one step higher and you'll be safe. But apparently we're all going to drown. We're all so stupid. We will sit there at the water's edge, lying down so the water laps in our mouth. It's just crazy. So clearly this is nuts. But someone proclaims it as an item of faith. And the government doing something about it. Again, a Christian thing. You cross yourself, you know, or like a player going out in the soccer field. That's not going to make him score more goals. Similarly, nothing Australia do will actually stop global warming. Nothing. Now, Ray knew all this. I think you would have seen it a little bit like, you know, Moses turns his back for 1 minute and the Israelites are all praying to a golden calf. What are you going to do? Somehow that's happened with the churches. Turn your back and before you know, they're all earth worshippers. Ray in 2006, this is really important, 12 years ago, the height of the global warming scare hadn't happened for another year or two. It was 2007-8. That's when it really got bad at its worst. In 2006, he was already writing that the global warming scam has been arguably the most extraordinary example of a scientific fraud in the post-war period. And he was correct. And he put out a book called The 9 Myths of Global Warming. This too inspired me to keep going. What I find remarkable rereading this is that how before a lot of the evidence came in, he knew it already. I went through those 9 points. I won't read them all. But there were a couple that really struck me as remarkable in how prescient he was. He said, for instance, the recent warm period from 1976 to 2000, this is point 3, appears to have come to an end. In fact, in the 12 years since, we see virtually zero warming this century. He was right before it actually happened. It's incredible. I looked at the latest satellite data from last month, coldest September for 10 years. It's above the long-term average, the 30-year average from 1980 by 0.14 of a degree. So essentially nothing. He mentioned, in point 6, he had a go at Al Gore, saying that these people were promoting claims like the decline of the polar bear population, which he said was wrong. The polar bear population numbers, as we've seen since, have increased. He nailed that. He hadn't even seen that Coca-Cola had done that whole thing where it printed, you know, cans and bottles with the polar bear symbol because they were so convinced the polar bears were dying because of global warming, and that was their poster child. No one talks about polar bears anymore. No one. He talks about, he mentions in point 6, hurricanes, cyclones, other extreme weather events. He said there's no evidence to justify they're getting worse. No evidence. The latest IPCC report, just a few days ago, buried in there, which the ABC did not report, said, indeed, we have had fewer cyclones, no evidence that we can trust of worse cyclones. Ray was right. The ABC, he said that in 2006, the ABC won't even report in 2018. And of course he said, more carbon dioxide in the air will promote plant growth everywhere, point 7. And the latest research last year and the year before, reported by NASA, so you can trust it, huh? From a quarter to a half of Earth vegetated lands showed significant greening. The planet is indeed greening. I find, and point 9 was any democratic government that tries seriously to decarbonise the country is going to be in severe political strife. Since Ray's death, we've seen, of course, politicians pay, political leaders pay for their folly by losing their jobs. Julia Gillard, one, of course, there will be no carbon tax in the government I lead, and Malcolm Turnbull, the other. quite extraordinary. The power of one. This is why Ray Evans has inspired me. He knew that he did a lot of this, I suspect. He knew he wouldn't see this come to fruition to the end of his life, before the end of his life. And some years ago, I think it was 20, I can't do maths. Where's the treasurer when you need him? 24 years ago, at a conference of the HR Nicholls Society, he actually quoted a poem after Hugh Clough. I've never heard of the guy, but Ray knew everything. Saying, say not that the struggle naught availeth. The labour and the wounds are vain. The enemy faints not, nor faileth. But in the end, the great tide will come. Ray inspired me to keep fighting. We're inspired, I think, other people in this room to keep fighting. We will win because the truth will prevail in the end. In the end. We've just got to live that long to see it. Ray inspired me. I hope one day someone will say that I inspired them. I hope someone will say you inspired them. Ray's gift for inspiration, I hope that passes on, because that is really, in the end, what will keep us going. Thank you very much.